The late afternoon sun bled across the Dakota Territory, like a wound staining the endless grasslands in shades of rust and amber. August heat shimmered above the wagon road, distorting the horizon into liquid waves. Dust hung in the still air, coating the sagebrush and buffalo grass that stretched unbroken in every direction, except where the Badlands rose like broken teeth to the east. Dakota lay face down in the wheel rut, one arm twisted beneath him, the other reaching uselessly toward the rifle that had fallen 10 feet away. His buckskin shirt, decorated with quill work his mother had stitched before the winter sickness took her, was soaked black from shoulder to hip. 3 eagle feathers gifts, marking his participation in the Treaty Council of 1868, lay trampled in the dirt beside his head. His breathing came in short, wet gasps that rattled in his chest. He'd been running for 6 hours before the bullet found him. 8-year-old Alice Pike noticed the buzzards first. 3 of them circled lazily above the road, ahead their shadows crossing and recrossing the packed earth. She'd been walking home from the seasonal berry thicket 2 miles east, her apron full of late summer chokecherries, when the birds caught her attention. Buzzards meant death or the promise of it. She approached carefully the way Uncle Andrew had taught her: scan the horizon, first check for movement, never assume you're alone. The figure beside the road didn't move. She dropped her apron, scattering purple-black berries across the dust, and ran. Up close, she could see he was breathing. Barely. A Lakota man, maybe 35 years old, with the kind of face that looked carved from the same stone as the Badlands. Blood pooled beneath him, soaking into the thirsty ground. Alice had helped Aunt Miriam with difficult birthing's lambs, mostly once a breech calf, and she knew the basic principle: stop the bleeding or nothing else mattered. She dropped to her knees, pressed both small palms against the wettest part of his shirt, and leaned her weight into it. "Don't you die," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "I'm too little to drag you anywhere, so you have to stay alive until I figure this out." His eyes opened to dark brown, almost black, swimming with pain and confusion. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Alice glanced around. The road stretched empty in both directions, nothing but grass and wind and the circling buzzards. Then movement flickered at the edge of her vision. Riders, 2 of them maybe half a mile south, sitting their horses at the crest of a low rise. Even at this distance, she could read their posture, hunters confirming a kill before claiming their prize. Her heart kicked hard against her ribs. Think fast. The wounded man wore a knife in a beaded sheath. A gun belt emptied the revolver, probably lost in his fall. The rifle lay in plain sight. Alice kept one hand pressing his wound and used the other to hook the rifle strap with her foot, dragging it close enough to kick it under a clump of dried sage. The knife she tucked into her own belt, hidden by her pinafore. The riders turned their horses and started down the slope at an easy trot. Alice made her decision in the space between heartbeats. She grabbed handfuls of road dust and rubbed them into her hair, across her face, ground them into her dress until she looked like she'd been wandering lost for hours. Then she stood, took a deep breath, and began to wail a high, desperate sound that carried across the empty land like a coyote's cry. The riders heard. They angled toward her, closing the distance. "What in blazes?" The first man pulled up short. He was perhaps 50, weathered as old leather, with a drooping mustache yellowed by tobacco. "Girl, what are you doing out here alone?" Alice didn't have to fake the tears that sprang to her eyes. Terror was useful that way. "My uncle's wagon." She sobbed, pointing vaguely back toward the berry thicket. "He told me to wait, but he's been gone forever, and I got scared of the dark coming, and I started walking, but I don't know which way." "There's a dead Indian here," the second rider interrupted. Younger, maybe 25, with a pockmarked face and nervous hands on his rifle. "Dying," the older man corrected, squinting at Dakota. Looks like the one on the poster Mercer's been circulating. The troublemaker from the Watergate incident. That's $50. That's also a witness. The older man jerked his chin at Alice. Little girl who'll tell everyone in Widow's Well that she saw us shoot a dying man. So she's just a kid. Who's gonna believe? Everyone, you damn fool. You want the territorial marshal asking questions. Mercer pays us to solve problems quiet like, not create new ones. He glanced at the sun, already touching the western horizon. Besides, we got maybe an hour of light left. I ain't riding this country after dark for $50 or $50,000. Comanche's been raiding south of here all month. The younger man shifted in his saddle, scanning the darkening Badlands nervously. What about him? He'll be dead by morning. Buzzards'll clean up the evidence. The older man tipped his hat mockingly at Alice. You head back that way, little miss. Follow the wagon ruts west. You'll hit the Johansson place before full dark. They wheeled their horses and rode south at a canter, raising a plume of dust that hung golden in the slanting light. Alice counted to 100, then counted again to be sure. When the riders had vanished completely, she dropped beside Dakota and pressed both hands over his wound again. His eyes had closed. His skin felt cold despite the heat radiating from the road. Stay with me, she whispered. Without thinking about it, she matched her breathing to his slow, steady willing her life force into his failing body. People are dying because the water's being stolen. If you're the one who can fix it, you can't die here. You understand? You have to live. A dry wind rattled through the sage. Somewhere in the darkening Badlands, a coyote voiced its first evening call, answered immediately by two more. The sound made the hair on Alice's arms stand up. She looked at the blood-soaked man beside her, at the empty road, at the first stars pricking through the deepening blue overhead. Well, she said aloud, I guess we're doing this the hard way. 7 days earlier, Dakota had watched the stagecoach wreckage from a granite outcrop 300 yards distant, his field glasses purchased from a St. Louis trading post in 1873, focused on the scattered debris. The coach had been stripped already. Bodies of the driver and guard lay in the sage bloating in the August sun, surrounded by the dark circles where blood had soaked into the earth and dried black. Whoever hit the stage had done it professional single ambush point, where the road curved blind around a washout, quick execution, thorough looting. But they'd missed something. The strongbox lay half buried in the wash itself, cracked open by repeated blows from a sledgehammer. Its contents were scattered, a few coins trampled into the mud, some letters and documents deemed worthless, and underneath it all, partially hidden by an overturned saddlebag, a bundle of telegraph flimsy paper bound with string. Dakota descended the outcrop, carefully studying the tracks. The raiders had been 4 men on unshod ponies, Cheyenne, probably working north of their usual range. They'd have taken anything valuable and ridden hard for the Llano Estacado. The stage company's freight manifest would have listed mail payroll for the Snakebite Station railhead and personal valuables. The telegraph messages wouldn't have interested them. But they interested Dakota. He'd been tracking Valentine Mercer's operation for 3 months, ever since his cousin Red Hawk came back from a supply run to Widow's Well, with stories about the water being sold by the barrel. Red Hawk thought it was just frontier price gouging, unpleasant, but common during drought years. Dakota suspected something more deliberate. The 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty had established territorial boundaries and resource rights, including riparian access to streams and rivers. Under both treaty law and territorial water codes, no individual could dam a natural waterway without federal approval. But Mercer had installed an iron gate at the main river intake that fed the entire basin, effectively controlling who got water and who died of thirst. The Lakota camps upstream had been forced to move twice seeking clean water from distant springs. The settler homesteads downstream watched their cattle die daily. Mercer's freight wagons rolled through town, weekly delivering water barrels at $3 each, a fortune for most families. When Lakota confronted the gate guards a month ago, it had nearly turned into a shooting match. He'd fired one warning shot that grazed a guard's shoulder, then retreated before the situation escalated into something that would bring the cavalry down on his band. Mercer's men printed bounty posters the next day. Wanted for assault and attempted murder, Lakota man approximately 35 years old, distinguished by eagle feather headdress, $50 reward. The telegraph messages were exactly what Lakota needed documentary evidence of Mercer's scheme. He spent 2 days decoding them with help from Zaltana, a Cheyenne trader who'd learned telegraph operation while working for the Union Pacific. The messages revealed shipping orders for water barrels, payment schedules for guards, and most damning instructions to maintain reduced flow at intake gate, correlated with premium pricing during high-demand period. It was a monopoly. Illegal, deliberate, and murderously effective. Lakota had been riding east to deliver the evidence to Territorial Judge Paul Rutledge in Blue Mountain when a rifle shot killed his horse and a man appeared from the rocks demanding the saddlebag. The rustler had been following him for 20 miles, waiting for the right moment. Lakota gave up the bag rather than die over it, then tracked the man on foot for 3 more days, moving through the Badlands like his grandfather had taught him, patient, invisible, inevitable. He caught up to the rustler near Anvil Creek at sunset, got the telegraph messages back, then took a bullet that tumbled him down a 12-foot embankment and left him bleeding into the Dakota dust. If not for a child gathering berries, the buzzards would have finished what the rustler started. Widow's Well occupied a shallow basin where seasonal runoff from the Badlands collected in a series of natural springs before feeding into the main river channel. The town had erupted almost overnight when the Union Pacific Railroad pushed through in 1876, establishing a water stop and freight depot. 2 years later, it boasted a main street lined with false-fronted buildings, 3 saloons, 2 churches, a general store, a telegraph office, and enough rough characters to keep the Territorial Marshal's office in Blue Mountain very busy. The Marshal himself never visited. Too far, too dangerous, and frankly, not worth the trouble unless someone filed an official complaint. Widow's Well governed itself through a combination of social pressure, economic coercion, and the occasional hanging frontier justice, applied with varying degrees of fairness. Valentine Mercer owned the freight company, the largest saloon, the general store, and held controlling interest in the water rights. He was 52 years old, built like a bull, with the kind of confidence that came from 30 years of getting exactly what he wanted through a combination of sharp business sense and calculated violence. He dressed well suits ordered from Denver, boots from St. Louis, and conducted himself with the air of a man who believed civilization was something you imposed on the wilderness through sheer will and sufficient capital. His men included Coyote Kid, a 30-year-old gunfighter who'd killed 3 men in Colorado before drifting east, and Crooked Teeth Tom, a mixed-blood tracker whose father had been Arikara and whose mother had worked in a Missouri brothel. Tom spoke 4 languages and could track a mouse across bare rock. Mercer paid them well and expected absolute loyalty. Barnaby Keene ran his medical practice from a converted feed store on the east side of town. At 40 years old, he'd seen more suffering than most men encountered in 3 lifetimes: cholera epidemics, botched amputations, childbed fever, gunshot wounds, knife fights, and the slow, grinding poverty that killed more people than violence ever did. But the cases arriving lately troubled him more than anything in his experience. Mercury poisoning. The symptoms were unmistakable if you knew what to look for. Tremors in the hands, difficulty speaking, memory loss, open sores that wouldn't heal. He'd documented 23 cases in 4 months, all among people who drank from the river downstream of Ricardo Sola's stamp mill. Sola crushed gold ore using mercury amalgamation, a common process throughout the western mining districts. The mercury bound with gold particles, forming an amalgam that could be heated to separate the precious metal. It was efficient and profitable. It was also highly toxic, and dumping the mercury-laden tailings into public waterways violated territorial mining regulations established in 1872. But Sola was Mercer's business partner, and the territorial mining inspector had been paid to look elsewhere. Barnaby kept meticulous records in a leather-bound ledger, patient names, symptoms, progression timelines, and water source locations. He cross-referenced everything, building a case through careful documentation. He didn't know what he'd do with the evidence yet, but he was constitutionally incapable of watching people die without at least trying to understand why. Genevieve Hart taught school in a one-room building painted white, though the paint was peeling badly and the whole structure leaned slightly south, victim of poor foundation work and harsh winters. She was 35, originally from Boston, widowed by cholera in 1875. She'd come west because the frontier needed teachers, and because she couldn't bear staying in the city where every street corner reminded her of her husband. She held classes during the day for children whose families could spare them from farm work, and evening sessions for adults seeking basic literacy. She also sheltered 3 boys from the orphan train program, Jack 11, Samuel 10, and Peter 9. They'd been shipped west from New York City slums, theoretically to be adopted by farming families, but in practice often worked as unpaid labor. Genevieve had intercepted them at the train station, claimed them as her nephews, and put them to work around the schoolhouse in exchange for education and a place to sleep. The boys were sharp as razors despite their rough backgrounds. Jack had run messages for a Wall Street broker before his mother's death. Samuel had worked in a telegraph office, learning Morse code by ear. Peter had stolen enough to stay alive and developed a talent for picking locks and solving mechanical puzzles. Andrew Pike farmed a quarter-section claim north of town with his wife Miriam. He was 40, steady as a plow horse, decent to the bone, and drowning in debt. His cattle herd had numbered 40 head in spring. By August 16, animals remained alive. The rest had died of thirst or been sold for fractions of their value when Mercer's water barrels became the only option. Andrew owed money to the freight company for hauling to the general store for seed and supplies to the bank controlled by Mercer through a silent partnership for his original land loan. The debt compounded faster than he could work it off. He was 3 months from losing everything. Miriam Pike was 30, practical as a hammer, and tougher than most men gave her credit for. She'd grown up on a cattle ranch in Texas before her father sold out in 1870 and moved the family east. She could rope, ride, shoot, and read weather with the accuracy of a barometer. She wore a revolver on her hip when she rode into town, a converted 1860 Army Colt that had belonged to her father. And nobody questioned it, because frontier women who couldn't defend themselves didn't last long. She was also Rose's younger sister, though the two hadn't spoken in 8 years. Rose Whitfield had returned to Widow's Well 6 months ago, taking up residence in a small room behind the seamstress shop and working quietly, avoiding attention. She was 28, still beautiful, despite the weariness etched around her eyes and mouth. She'd been married briefly to Thomas Whitfield, a storekeeper who died of pneumonia in 1875, leaving her widowed with a daughter to raise. Alice was 8 now, small for her age, but sturdy, with dark hair and darker eyes that seemed to absorb more than a child should. Officially, she was Thomas Whitfield's daughter. The story everyone knew was that Rose had married Thomas in 1871, given birth to Alice in 1872, lost her husband in 1875, and spent 3 years working in St. Louis before returning to family. The truth was more complicated and far more dangerous. Rose kept a single photograph hidden in her sewing basket, a tintype of baby Alice at 6 months old, lying on a blanket. In the image, Rose's hand rested on the baby's stomach. Around Rose's wrist was a beaded thong necklace, white and blue beads, in an alternating pattern, simple but carefully made. That necklace had been a gift from Lakota in the summer of 1870 during a brief and fragile ceasefire near the sacred Black Hills. They'd met by accident. Rose had been gathering wild mint along Rapid Creek. Lakota had been checking rabbit snares his cousin had set. They'd startled each other, both reaching for weapons before realizing the other was alone and unarmed. They should have walked away. The social prohibition against relationships between settlers and Lakota was absolute, enforced by law in some territories, by lynch mobs in others. But they were young, and loneliness was a powerful force on the frontier. They met again the next day, and the day after. Through that summer, they carved out stolen hours, learning each other's languages, sharing stories about their completely incompatible worlds. Lakota made her the beaded necklace. Rose carved him a small wooden bird, a meadowlark, the meadowlark she'd loved since childhood. Her father discovered them in August, kissing beside the creek. He dragged Rose home and put her on an eastbound train the next morning, paying a widow from Philadelphia to chaperone her to distant cousins in Pennsylvania. Rose never got the chance to tell Lakota she was leaving. She certainly didn't know she was pregnant. 2 months later, facing social ruin and her father's fury, she married Thomas Whitfield, a kind, frail man who understood her situation and offered his name to protect the child. He loved Alice as his own, never treating her differently despite knowing the truth. When he died, Rose moved to St. Louis, working as a seamstress and keeping Alice safe from the prejudice that would follow her if people knew her father was Lakota. But Miriam's letters last year had been increasingly desperate: water shortages, cattle dying, Mercer's stranglehold tightening. Rose made the difficult decision to return. Alice needed family, and Miriam needed help managing the farm, while Andrew worked himself to exhaustion trying to save it. Rose hadn't expected Lakota to still be alive, still in the territory. She'd convinced herself he'd moved north with Crazy Horse's band, or west into the Montana country, or simply fallen to one of the 100 ways the frontier killed young men. The possibility of encountering him again terrified and compelled her in equal measure. The line cabin where Alice dragged Lakota was actually an abandoned claim shanty from the failed homestead rush of 1875. Half dugout, half sod structure with a sagging roof and walls that barely kept out the wind. But it was shelter, and it was hidden in a fold of land, a quarter-mile off the main wagon road. Lakota regained full consciousness near midnight, his head clearing enough to register several facts so he was lying on moldy straw. His ribs were wrapped in fabric that smelled like choke cherries, and a small child was asleep beside him, with one hand resting on his arm, as if keeping watch even in sleep. "You're awake," Alice said, eyes opening instantly. "How do you feel?" "Like I got shot and fell off a cliff," Lakota rasped. His throat felt lined with sand. Alice offered a canteen. "Sip slow. Aunt Miriam says if you drink too fast when you're hurt, you'll vomit." He obeyed, letting the water wet his mouth without swallowing much. "Thank you for helping." "You're welcome." She studied him with disconcerting directness. "Are you really trying to stop Mercer from stealing the water?" "Yes." "Then we're on the same side. Our cattle are dying. Uncle Andrew sold his pocket watch last week to buy 2 barrels of water. It wasn't enough." She said it matter-of-factly, the way children on the frontier learn to discuss hardship as simple reality, requiring no emotional decoration. "The telegraph messages prove what he's doing," Lakota said. "If I can get them to the territorial judge, Judge Rutledge in Blue Mountain. Aunt Miriam mentioned him. She says he's one of the honest ones." Alice glanced toward the broken door where pre-dawn gray was beginning to dilute the darkness. "But there are men looking for you. I heard them yesterday before I found you." They had rifles and a tracking dog. Dakota tried to sit up. Pain lanced through his side, forcing him back down. How far are we from town? 4 miles, maybe 5, but we can't stay here. They'll search everywhere. Do you know somewhere safer? Alice thought about it. The schoolhouse. Miss Hart lets me sleep there sometimes when Uncle Andrew and Aunt Miriam are arguing about money. She has a root cellar underneath, and Dr. Keene's office is next door. Can you bring someone here, someone you trust? Aunt Miriam. She'll come if I tell her it's important. And she won't shoot me. Alice smiled slightly. Probably not. She doesn't like Mercer either. She left at first light, moving through the dawn-gray landscape with the confidence of a child who knew every rise and hollow. Dakota lay still, conserving strength, listening to the meadowlarks begin their morning songs. Miriam Pike arrived 2 hours later alone, riding her bay mare and carrying her revolver openly. She entered the shanty with the gun drawn, took one look at Dakota and said, "Let me see the wound." He pulled aside the makeshift bandage. She examined it with clinical efficiency, checking for signs of infection, testing the edges. "You'll live if we get you proper care." She looked at his face. "Alice says you have evidence against Mercer. I want to see it." Dakota produced the telegraph flimsies from inside his shirt. Miriam unfolded them, squinting at the abbreviated codes and notations. "Can you read it?" he asked. "Enough. Water barrel shipments, gate maintenance, premium pricing structure." She looked up. This is proof he's doing it deliberately. Him and Ricardo Sola. The stamp mill upstream is dumping mercury waste. Miriam's jaw tightened. That explains why 3 families downriver have children with tremors and mouth sores. She refolded the papers and handed them back. "All right. We're moving you to the schoolhouse. Can you ride if I have to?" "You have to." They reached the schoolhouse just before noon, entering through the back door. Genevieve took one look at Dakota and sent Jack running for Dr. Keene. Barnaby arrived within minutes, black medical bag in hand, and set to work without questions or commentary. He cut away what remained of Dakota's shirt, cleaned the wound with boiled water and whiskey, both of which hurt worse than the original bullet, and stitched it closed with black thread and a curved needle. Dakota gritted his teeth and made no sound, though sweat soaked his forehead. Bullet grazed the 8th rib, but didn't crack it. Barnaby said, tying off the final stitch. "No internal bleeding that I can detect. You're lucky." "Doesn't feel lucky." "Compared to dead, it is." Barnaby wrapped his ribs with strips of clean linen. "You'll need rest, clean water, and protein if you can keep it down. No riding hard for at least a week." "I don't have a week." "Then you'll tear these stitches and bleed to death. Your choice." The door opened and Rose entered, carrying an armload of bandages and a clay jar of salve. She got 3 steps into the room before she saw Dakota's face. She stopped as if she'd walked into a wall. The jar slipped from her hand, hitting the floor with a dull thud that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Dakota stared at her, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were showing him. 8 years collapsed into nothing. She looked older lines around her eyes, wariness in her posture, but unmistakably, impossibly her. Rose's face went bone white. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Alice tugged her sleeve. "Mother, this is Dakota. He's the one I told you about. Dr. Keene just finished stitching him." The word mother hung in the air like a gunshot echo. Dakota felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of the world. He looked at Alice, really looked, and saw things he should have noticed immediately. The shape of her eyes, the line of her jaw, the particular shade of her dark hair. His heart stopped, restarted, began hammering against his ribs. Rose backed toward the door, shaking her head slightly. I need to. Rose. Genevieve's voice was gentle but firm. She took the bandages from Rose's arms. Perhaps you could help me prepare a poultice in the kitchen. Rose nodded mutely and fled to the back room. Dakota couldn't speak. His mind was reeling, trying to connect fragments of impossible information into something coherent. Barnaby finished wrapping his ribs, glanced between Dakota and the doorway, where Rose had vanished, and said nothing. But his expression suggested he understood more than he was saying. Alice sat down beside Dakota, her small hand resting on the edge of the examination table. You need to rest now. Miss Hart says you can use the storage room. It has a cot. He nodded, not trusting his voice. She helped him to his feet and guided him to the storage room, more of a large closet, really, with a narrow cot and a single window overlooking the prairie. He sank onto the cot, exhaustion and shock hitting simultaneously. Through the open door, he could hear Rose and Genevieve speaking in low voices. He couldn't make out the words, but he recognized the tone, urgent, frightened, desperate. He lay back carefully, staring at the ceiling, and tried to make his reeling thoughts hold still long enough to think. By the next afternoon, Dakota was strong enough to sit upright and examine the telegraph messages properly with Genevieve's help. The 3 orphan boys crowded around their sharp eyes, trained by city survival to spot patterns and decode information. This notation here, Jack said, pointing to a series of abbreviations. WBSS 16PA. Water Barrels Snakebite Station 16 units payment advance. That's not normal supply routing. Samuel traced another message. And this talks about intake gate maintenance. But the dates match exactly when Dr. Keene's ledger shows the first mercury poisoning cases. Peter, smallest and quickest of the 3, tapped a third flimsy. This code is railroad freight. I ran messages near the shipping offices in New York. This says they're moving stamped ore through night trains to avoid manifest inspections. Barnaby produced his medical ledger and laid it open beside the telegraphs. 23 documented cases, all from families drinking river water below Sola's mill. The symptoms are textbook mercury exposure, erethism, symptoms of mercury poisoning, erethism, mercurialis, tremors, cognitive impairment. Genevieve cross-referenced the dates. Sola's operation expanded in April, right when the poisoning cases started accelerating, and Mercer installed the water gate in March. So they're partners, Andrew said from the doorway. He'd arrived with Miriam an hour earlier, ostensibly delivering supplies, but actually joining the impromptu council. Mercer controls water distribution, Sola poisons what's left, and they both profit while everyone else dies slowly. We need to get this evidence to Judge Rutledge, Miriam said. He can order a territorial investigation, maybe bring in federal marshals. Blue Mountain is 40 miles. Dakota pointed out. Open country most of the way, and Mercer's men are watching every road. Then we go at night, Andrew suggested. Take the old freight trail through Copper Canyon. It's rough, but it bypasses the main roads. Rose spoke from the corner where she'd been standing silently. And who rides 40 miles through hostile country carrying evidence that men are willing to kill for? Everyone looked at each other. I'll go, Dakota said. It's my evidence. You can barely stand, Barnaby said bluntly. You'll tear your stitches before you make it 5 miles. Then we send a messenger, Genevieve suggested. Someone small, fast, and above suspicion. Alice straightened. I can do it. Absolutely not, Rose said immediately. Why not? I'm small, I know the country, and nobody would suspect a child of carrying important documents. Because you're 8 years old, and I won't risk losing you two, Rose stopped abruptly, her face flushing. An awkward silence settled over the room. Dakota cleared his throat. There's a Cheyenne trader named Zaltana who camps near Willow Springs. He knows hidden routes through the arroyos, and he's honest. If Alice could carry a message to him, basic hand signals, nothing complicated, he could get the evidence to Blue Mountain safely. Can you teach her the signals? Genevieve asked. Yes, but it would take time. We have time, Miriam said. Mercer thinks you're dead or dying out on the prairie somewhere. We have maybe 2 days before his men expand the search to town. Rose looked at Alice, conflict written plainly across her face. Finally, she nodded. Teach her. But she doesn't go alone. I'm riding with her to Willow Springs. Mother, that's the condition. Accept it, or we find another way. Alice glanced at Dakota, who gave a slight nod. All right. They spent the rest of that day in the small yard, behind the schoolhouse, Dakota, teaching Alice basic Lakota hand signals, while Genevieve kept watch. The gestures were simple but precise, meeting place, danger, trust, document, judge. Alice learned quickly, her small fingers mimicking his movements with impressive accuracy. When she struggled with a particular sign, crossing her wrists with palms up to indicate help needed, Dakota gently repositioned her hands, showing her the correct angle. Their eyes met briefly, and he saw intelligence there, determination, and something else. An unconscious echo of expressions he'd seen in his own mother's face. From the window, Rose watched them, her hands stilled over the shirt she was mending. That evening, while the others planned routes and contingencies, Dakota found Rose alone in the schoolhouse kitchen. She was mending a torn coat by lamplight, her needle flashing quick and efficient. He stood in the doorway, uncertain how to begin. You should have told me, he said quietly. Rose's hands stilled. How your band moved north that winter. My father made sure I didn't know where. And even if I'd found you, what then? Do you know what they would have done to you if they discovered us, to both of us? I would have tried. To get yourself killed. Dakota, they were already looking for excuses to break the treaty. A Lakota man and a settler woman. She shook her head. They would have hanged you and called it justice. And you married someone else. I married Thomas to give her a name and a future. He was kind. He knew the truth and he loved her anyway. He gave Alice the one thing I couldn't, a life without everyone knowing she was. She stopped, unable to finish. Mine, Dakota said softly. She's mine. Rose finally looked up, tears shining in her eyes. Yes. He crossed the room and knelt beside her chair. I'm not leaving her again, or you. You're wanted by half the territory. Then we'll leave the territory and go where there's nowhere for people like us, not in this world. Dakota reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. Her fingers were cold despite the warm evening. Then we make a place. After this is done. After Mercer's finished. Rose looked at their joined hands, her expression unreadable. Finally, she said, stay alive long enough to matter. Then we'll talk about futures. It wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't refusal either. Dakota would take what he could get. The telegraph tap came together through a combination of the orphan's technical knowledge and careful planning. Samuel and Jack climbed the pole outside Mercer's freight office at 2 a.m, wearing dark clothes and moving in silence. They spliced a second line off the main wire, delicate work requiring steady hands and good tools, and ran it through the shadows to the schoolhouse basement, where Peter had rigged a makeshift receiver from spare parts scavenged from the telegraph office's rubbish heap. Samuel, who'd learned Morse code by ear while working in New York, manned the receiver for the first shift. The others took turns through the night transcribing any messages that came through. The first intercept arrived at dawn, Drought conditions continue. Saturday delivery 50 barrels. Double premium pricing. Confirm payment advance. Mercer. Barnaby copied it into his ledger with grim satisfaction. That's documentary evidence of price manipulation during a crisis. A second message followed an hour later. Gate inspection Thursday. Remind crew no documentation of flow reduction. Verbal orders only. Mercer. He knows he's breaking the law, Genevieve said. He's being careful. But careful wasn't the same as smart, and smart wasn't the same as foolproof. Over 3 days, the orphans intercepted 17 messages. Taken together, they painted a damning picture: deliberate reduction of water flow, coordinated pricing with 2 other basin towns, also suffering shortages, and veiled references to Richardson's arrangement, which Barnaby recognized as code for Ricardo Sola's mercury dumping. This is enough, Miriam said, reviewing the transcripts. Combined with the original messages and Barnaby's medical records, we have a prosecutable case. Then we need to move it, Andrew said. Every day we wait is another day Mercer's men might find us. They loaded Andrew's wagon that night, grain sacks in the bed, farming tools hanging from the sides, a water barrel lashed to the rear, normal cargo for a farmer making a supply run. Hidden beneath a false bottom built by Peter were Barnaby's ledger, the original telegraph messages, and the intercept transcripts. Dakota was strong enough to walk now, though his ribs still ached with every breath. He climbed into the wagon bed and positioned himself behind the grain sacks with the Sharp's carbine, a single-shot breech-loader firing .52 caliber rounds common among buffalo hunters and reliable at 300 yards in practiced hands. "You can't seriously be coming," Barnaby protested. "You're not healed." "I can shoot. That's what matters." Miriam took the driver's seat reins in one hand and her revolver on the bench beside her. Andrew sat next to her with a double-barrel shotgun loaded with buckshot, devastating at close range, but useless past 50 feet. Alice climbed into the back with Dakota, ignoring her mother's protests. "You need someone small to scout ahead," she said with the implacable logic that sometimes possessed frontier children. "I can run faster than any of you if there's trouble." Rose looked like she wanted to argue, but recognized futility when she saw it. Instead, she pressed a folded kerchief into Alice's hand. "Keep this. If you need to signal wave it, I'll be watching from the ridge." "You're not riding with us?" Miriam asked. "Someone needs to warn Genevieve if Mercer's men come looking, and someone needs to watch your backs." Rose touched Dakota's arm, briefly, barely contact, but loaded with meaning. "Keep her safe." "I will." They set out at dusk, the wagon creaking down the freight road that wound southeast toward Copper Canyon. The first 8 miles passed uneventfully, the only sound the steady clop of hooves and the occasional call of nighthawks swooping for insects. Then they rounded a bend where the road descended into a cottonwood grove, bordering a creek, and 3 riders materialized from the shadows on the far bank. Coyote Kid sat his horse with casual arrogance, revolver holstered, but hand resting near it. 2 other men flanked him, one lean and nervous, the other built like a bull, both carrying rifles. "Evening." The kid called out, his voice pleasant and cold as creek water. "Where are you folks headed this late?" Andrew reined the team to a halt. "Supply run to my brother's place, south of here." "That's so." The kid smiled. "Funny, I heard Andrew Pike doesn't have a brother." Silence. "Step down from the wagon," the kid continued. "Nice and slow. We're going to have a look at what you're hauling." Miriam's hand moved toward her revolver. "Don't," the bull-built man said, raising his rifle. Dakota rose smoothly from behind the grain sacks, the Sharps already shouldered and aimed. "You're going to turn around and ride away now." The kid's eyes flicked to him, recognition sparking. Well now, the dead Indian. $50 says you ain't as dead as you should be. 60 says you're wrong. For 3 heartbeats, nobody moved. The creek burbled over stones. A nighthawk called. The horses shifted nervously. Then Alice grabbed the reins from Andrew and shouted, "Go!" at the top of her lungs, simultaneously snapping the leather against the horse's flanks. The team lunged forward. Coyote Kid's gun cleared leather as Dakota fired. The Sharps roared, bucking hard against his shoulder and sending pain lancing through his ribs. The bullet struck rock beside the kid's horse, spraying fragments. The animal reared, screaming. Miriam leaned out and fired twice with her revolver, not aiming to hit, just suppressing fire to keep heads down. One of the men fired back. His bullet punched through the wooden water barrel, releasing a stream that arced silver in the moonlight. The wagon careened into the creek ford. Water exploded around the wheels, drenching everyone. Alice drove like she'd been born to it, and the reins wrapped tight around her small fists, her face set in fierce concentration. Dakota levered the Sharp's action, ejecting the spent brass and fumbling a fresh cartridge from his belt. His hands were shaking from adrenaline and pain. He raised the rifle and fired again, just as the second rider lined up a shot. The heavy .52 caliber round caught the man's shoulder, spinning him out of his saddle. "The cut bank!" Miriam shouted over the chaos. There. An eroded overhang jutted from the creek bank about 50 yards ahead, its exposed roots forming a natural cave. Alice wrenched the team toward it, the wagon tilting dangerously on 2 wheels before slamming back down. They plunged under the overhang wheels, slipping on wet stone. Andrew leaped down and began unhitching the horses, leading them deeper into the shelter. Miriam reloaded her revolver with shaking hands. Dakota crouched at the entrance rifle, ready, trying to ignore the hot wetness soaking his shirt. His stitches had torn. Above and around them, hoofbeats thundered. Voices shouted orders. Riders splashed through the creek, searching. Alice pressed against Dakota's side, breathing hard. He could feel her trembling. Without thinking, he shifted his position to shield her with his body, putting himself between her and the open bank. His ribs felt like they were being torn apart, but he didn't move. The riders passed once, doubling back along the creek. Passed again, spreading out to check the willows and cattails. One horse splashed within 15 feet of the overhang, close enough that they could hear the riders' muttered curses. Then gradually, the sounds retreated downstream. They waited an hour in tense silence before Andrew whispered, "I think they're gone." "Or waiting for us to come out," Miriam countered. "Bleeding?" Alice said quietly, looking at Dakota's side. He glanced down. Blood had soaked through the bandage and shirt, dripping onto the stone beneath him. "I'm all right." "You're not." She pulled off her kerchief, the one Rose had given her, and pressed it against the wound. "Hold this." He obeyed, impressed despite himself by her steadiness. They emerged cautiously at dawn, when gray light made ambush less likely. The wagon was intact. The horses were tired, but sound. The false bottom had held. The evidence was safe. But the journey to Blue Mountain would have to wait. Dakota needed medical attention, and they needed to know whether Mercer's men were still searching the area. They returned to Widow's Well by a circuitous route, reaching the schoolhouse just as the sun cleared the eastern horizon. Rose was waiting outside. When she saw Alice climb down from the wagon whole and unhurt, her knees buckled with relief. When she saw the blood soaking Dakota's side, her face went white. "Inside," Barnaby ordered, his doctor's voice cutting through the emotional chaos. "Now." Barnaby spent an hour cleaning the wound, restitching what had torn and wrapping Dakota's ribs with fresh bandages, while delivering a lecture about the stupidity of riding in a wagon chase less than a week after being shot. Dakota bore it in silence, mainly because he knew Barnaby was right. "You're done," Barnaby said finally, tying off the wrapping with more force than strictly necessary. No more heroics. You rest or you die. Those are your choices. In the main schoolroom, the others held council. The intercept line had caught 2 more messages that morning. Schoolhouse suspected as insurgent base. Confirmed surveillance. Mercer. And 20 minutes later, Thursday night, Burns schoolhouse and doctor's office. Frame as Indian raid. Eliminate witnesses. Payment on completion. Mercer. The room went silent. That's tonight, Genevieve said quietly. He's eliminating anyone who could testify against him, Barnaby said. Medical records, documents, witnesses, all of it. We need to evacuate the children, Miriam said. And go where? Andrew asked. We're not fast enough to make Blue Mountain ahead of riders, and hiding in the prairie with children is suicide. Rose stood abruptly. This is my fault. Everyone looked at her. I should have told you, she said, looking at Dakota. 8 years ago, I should have found a way to send word. But I was afraid and I took the coward's path, and now, her voice cracked. Now we're all paying for it. Rose, Miriam started. No. Rose crossed to where Alice sat and knelt in front of her. Sweetheart, there's something I need to tell you about your father. About Thomas. Alice's eyes went very wide. What about him? Rose pulled the tintype photograph from her pocket, the one she'd been carrying for 8 years. She laid it on the table in front of Alice. Thomas was a good man who loved you very much. But he wasn't your blood father. Before I met him, I loved someone else. Someone I could never marry because the world wouldn't allow it. She looked up at Dakota. Someone who never knew you existed until now. Alice stared at the photograph, at Rose's hand on baby her, at the beaded thong around Rose's wrist in the image. Her gaze shifted slowly to Dakota, who sat frozen on the examination bench. That's why you look like him, Genevieve said softly. Your eyes, your hair. He's my father. Alice's voice was very small. Rose nodded, tears streaming down her face. Yes. Alice looked at Dakota. He looked back, every defense he'd ever built crumbling to dust. Slowly, he extended his hand. Alice took it, her small fingers disappearing into his calloused palm. You saved my life, Dakota said, his voice rough. Now I know why the world made sure you were there that day. Alice's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. Are you going to leave? Never. Promise, I promise. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his neck. Dakota closed his eyes and held her, carefully, mindful of his ribs, mindful of her fragility, mindful of the 8 years he'd lost and the impossible gift he'd been given. The moment shattered as glass broke somewhere in the front of the building. Samuel's voice from the basement. They're here, 4 men with torches. Genevieve moved first, herding Jack, Samuel, and Peter toward the root cellar entrance. Down, now. Stay quiet no matter what you hear. Barnaby grabbed his medical bag and Miriam by the arm. Back door. We can reach my office and fortify it. Andrew picked up the shotgun. I'll buy you time. Dakota stood, ignoring the stabbing pain in his side, and grabbed the sharps. Not alone you won't. Rose seized Alice's hand. We're leaving. Now. The smell hit, sharp chemical reek of kerosene. Through the windows, torchlight flickered. The front door crashed inward. Coyote Kid stood silhouetted against the night, revolver drawn. Behind him, 3 men spread along the front of the building, splashing kerosene against the walls from tin cans. Dakota fired without hesitation. The sharps boomed like thunder in the enclosed space. Coyote Kid dove sideways, the bullets splintering the doorframe where he'd been standing. Andrew rushed forward with the shotgun, triggering both barrels. The buckshot caught one of the kerosene men in the leg, dropping him screaming. The other two scattered. From the side of the building, 2 more shots cracked out. Genevieve had grabbed a rifle from the storage room and was firing from the kitchen doorway. Her first shot went wide. Her second caught Crooked Teeth Tom in the shoulder, spinning him into the dirt. Coyote Kid rolled to cover behind the water trough and fired 3 rapid shots. One shattered a window. Another punched through the wall. The third hit Genevieve in the upper arm, knocking her backward. She hit the door frame and slid down, clutching her arm and gasping. Barnaby ran back from the rear door, grabbed her under the arms, and dragged her behind the iron stove. Miriam bandages. Flames licked up the side of the building. The dry wood caught fast fire, spreading with terrifying speed. Inside, smoke began to thicken. Rose shoved Alice toward the back door. "Move! What about move?" Dakota levered the sharps and fired again, forcing Coyote Kid to duck. Andrew was reloading the shotgun, fingers fumbling the shells. One of the kerosene men appeared in the doorway and fired. The bullet caught Andrew in the arm. He staggered, dropping the shotgun. Dakota stepped in front of him, shouldered the sharps, and fired point blank. The man went down, clutching his leg, screaming. But the fire was spreading faster than they could fight. Smoke poured through the broken windows, choking and blinding. "We have to go," Barnaby shouted from the kitchen. They stumbled through the burning building in a choking mass, Dakota supporting Andrew Barnaby, half carrying Genevieve Miriam, firing blindly back toward the door to keep the attackers' heads down. They burst out the back door into cool night air. Andrew's wagon waited 20 yards away, horses stamping nervously. Rose and Alice were already aboard. Miriam ran for the driver's seat. Dakota and Andrew threw themselves into the bed as Miriam cracked the whip. The wagon lurched forward, wheels bouncing over the uneven ground. Behind them, the schoolhouse roof collapsed in a fountain of sparks that lit the sky like a false dawn. They raced toward the river road, but within minutes, they saw more riders ahead. 6 men blocking the bridge, rifles leveled and ready. "We're trapped," Andrew said hoarsely, clutching his bleeding arm. The wagon slowed. The riders advanced. Dakota's mind raced through options. The telegraph messages were hidden in the wagon's false bottom. Barnaby's ledger was there too. If Mercer's men took the wagon, they'd burn the evidence and kill everyone who knew the truth. He looked at Rose, at Alice, at the burning town behind them. The choice was impossible and inevitable. He grabbed the oilcloth bundle containing Barnaby's ledger and shoved it at Andrew. "When I move, you run. Get them out." "Dakota!" He vaulted from the wagon before anyone could stop him, sprinting toward the line of riders and firing the sharps wildly to draw their attention. Bullets kicked up dust around his feet. He levered the action, fired again. The riders wheeled toward him, momentarily forgetting the wagon. Andrew didn't waste the chance. He grabbed the reins from Miriam and wrenched the team hard right off the road and down toward the river ford. The wagon crashed through brush, tilted dangerously, righted itself. One rider broke away to pursue them. Dakota tackled him as he passed both men, hitting the ground hard. They fought with desperate fury, fists, elbows, knees. The rider drove his knee into Dakota's ribs where the wound was. Pain exploded white and blinding through his vision. The rider scrambled for his dropped rifle. A gunshot cracked. The rider fell. Miriam stood 30 feet away, revolver smoking. "Get in the wagon!" Dakota ran. The wagon had already turned back, Andrew driving one-handed while Miriam reloaded. Dakota hauled himself into the bed ribs, screaming. They plunged into the river ford. The current was stronger than expected, recent rains swelling the flow. Water poured over the sides, soaking everyone and everything. Riders reached the bank behind them and fired. Bullets splashed into the water, thudding into the wooden sides. The team strained, pulling hard against the current. The wagon rocked violently, and the oilcloth bundle slipped from Andrew's blood-slicked grip. Dakota lunged for it, but too late. It hit the water and vanished into the black current. All of Barnaby's meticulously documented medical records gone. They reached the far bank and scrambled up the muddy slope, the horses foam-flecked and heaving. The riders on the opposite side fired a few more shots, but the range was too great. They'd escaped. But they'd lost their most damning evidence. They regrouped in a wash, 2 miles from town, the wagon hidden in the shadows of a limestone overhang. Genevieve sat propped against the stone wall, face pale and lips tight with pain. Barnaby had bound her arm with strips torn from his own shirt, but blood was still seeping through. Andrew's wound was less serious, a deep graze that would scar but hadn't hit bone or artery. He sat beside Miriam, who reloaded her revolver with steady hands, despite the tremors trying to set in. The 3 orphans had escaped through the root cellar and made their way to the rendezvous point on foot, showing up dirty and terrified, but alive. Rose held Alice close, whispering things Dakota couldn't hear. He stood apart from the group, staring at the dark ribbon of river visible in the distance. Somewhere in that current, Barnaby's ledger was disintegrating ink, bleeding away months of careful documentation, washing out to sea. "We still have the telegraph messages," Genevieve said quietly, reading his thoughts. "The originals and the intercepts. That's documentary evidence." "It's not enough," Dakota said. "Messages can be claimed as forgeries. Medical records from a respected doctor would have been harder to dismiss." "So we get new evidence," Andrew said. "Direct evidence. We go to the source." Everyone looked at him. "The Watergate," Andrew continued. "If we open it, destroy it completely, so it can't be closed again, Mercer's monopoly collapses. People can drink freely. Cattle can drink. Without the leverage, he's just another criminal waiting to be prosecuted. His men guard that gate day and night," Miriam pointed out. "Then we go at night during the storm." Dakota nodded toward the western horizon, where lightning flickered in massive thunderheads. "We'll have cover, noise, chaos." "It's a suicide run," Rose said quietly. "Maybe. But if we don't try, he wins. More people die. Children keep getting poisoned. And Alice grows up in a world where men like Mercer make the rules." Rose met his eyes. Something passed between them: acknowledgement, fear, reluctant acceptance. "I'm going," Alice said. "No," Rose said immediately. "Yes, I'm the smallest. I can get to the winch mechanism while you distract the guards. And you need everyone you can get." "She's right," Dakota said quietly. "But she follows orders instantly. No arguments. No risks." Rose looked like she wanted to refuse, but she glanced around at the exhausted wounded group and recognized reality. They needed every advantage. "All right," she said finally. "But you stay between us. Always." Alice nodded solemnly. They moved out an hour before midnight, traveling on foot through the storm-dark prairie. Lightning illuminated the landscape in brilliant flashes, each strike rendering the world in stark black and white. Thunder rolled continuously, the sound masking their movements. Dakota, Rose, and Alice approached the Watergate from 3 directions. Andrew and Miriam hung back with rifles ready to provide covering fire. Genevieve stayed with the orphans, a mile distant, too injured to fight, but able to ride for help if things went catastrophically wrong. The gate loomed ahead, a skeletal iron structure silhouetted against the storm. A single lantern swung from the winch platform, its light swaying wildly in the wind. 2 guards huddled near the mechanism, wrapped in oilcloth slickers, rifles propped nearby. Dakota circled wide, using the curtains of rain for concealment. His ribs throbbed with every movement, the fresh bandages already soaking through with blood and rain. He reached the base of the platform and began climbing the iron ladder, each rung slick and treacherous. One guard turned, peering into the darkness. A rifle shot cracked from the rocks to the right, Rose firing high to draw attention without killing. The guard shouted and grabbed his weapon, firing back blindly. Lakota hauled himself onto the platform and charged. He slammed into the first guard, driving him against the railing. They grappled, feet slipping on wet metal. The guard threw a punch that glanced off Lakota's jaw. Lakota responded with a vicious elbow to the man's temple, stunning him. The second guard swung his rifle like a club. Lakota ducked. The stock whistled past his head. He came up hard, driving his shoulder into the man's midsection. They both went down. Rose appeared on the platform, soaked and breathing hard. She grabbed the winch crank and threw her weight against it. Nothing. It was locked with an iron pin. "Alice!" she shouted over the storm. Alice darted out from beneath the platform, scrambled to the brake lever, and pulled. The pin disengaged with a metallic clang. Rose heaved against the crank. The gate groaned, resisting. She threw her full weight into it, muscles straining. The crank moved an inch. Another. Coyote Kid came out of nowhere, vaulting onto the platform with his revolver drawn. He fired. The bullet sparked off metal inches from Rose's hand. Lakota tackled him, and they crashed into the winch wheel, Lakota's ribs exploding in fresh agony. The kid drove a fist into the wound, then pulled his knife. "Should have finished you on the road," he snarled. He drove the knife toward Lakota's chest. Lakota caught his wrist, straining against the kid's strength. The blade inched closer, rain streaming between them. Rose grabbed a length of chain and swung it hard, catching the kid across the side of the head. He roared and turned on her, knife rising. Lakota surged upright and tackled him again. They smashed through the railing and fell. Rose screamed. The fall lasted forever and no time at all. Lakota hit the churning water and went under the current, seizing him with crushing force. He tumbled in blind darkness, lungs burning, ribs grinding with each impact against submerged rocks. His hand found something solid, a post, a rock, something. He clung to it and broke the surface, gasping. The current tried to tear him away. His strength was failing. "Lakota!" Rose's voice barely audible over the storm. He looked up. She was lying flat on the platform edge, reaching down. 20 feet below, Alice had jammed an iron pry bar under the winch wheel to stop it reversing, and was throwing her small weight onto it to keep it locked. "Grab my hand," Rose shouted. Lakota reached up. Their fingers touched, slipped. He tried again, stretching despite the agony in his side. This time her hand clamped around his wrist with desperate strength. She pulled. He kicked, fighting the current, using his free hand to grab the platform support. Inch by agonizing inch, she hauled him up, her face twisted with effort. He made it to the platform and collapsed, coughing up river water. The winch gave way with a tortured metallic shriek. The gate burst open. Pent-up water exploded through in a massive surge that swept away barrels, debris, 2 of Mercer's men who'd been waiting too close, and everything else in its path. Coyote Kid's head broke surface 30 yards downstream, arms flailing before the current dragged him under and out of sight. Lakota forced himself upright, every part of him screaming in protest. "We're not finished." Rose stared at him. "What?" "Mercer. He'll run. Burn evidence, telegraph false reports from Snakebite Station, disappear into the territories. We need to stop him now, or this was all for nothing." Rose looked at Alice, then back at Lakota. She nodded once. They found 2 of the guards' horses tethered nearby and mounted Alice, riding with Rose. They pushed the animals hard through the storm, following the railroad grade toward Snakebite Station. The timber trestle appeared through the rain. a spindly structure of railroad ties and support beams spanning a ravine 60 feet deep. On the far side, visible in lightning flashes, Mercer and 3 riders were stacking kerosene barrels and lighting a fuse to blow the bridge and cover their escape. Dakota and Rose reached the near end as the fuse sparked to life, hissing and spitting in the rain. Dakota grabbed Rose and pulled her behind a signal post, shielding her body with his. "Can you shoot?" "Yes." He handed her the sharps, quickly showing her the falling block action. Their faces were inches apart, rain streaming between them. First shot hit the fuse. Second shot Mercer's foreman, if you can. Rose braced the rifle against the post and fired. The recoil drove into her shoulder, bruising hard. The fuse exploded in a spray of sparks. She worked the lever, chambered a fresh round, and fired again. The foreman clutched his shoulder and went down. Dakota sprinted across the trestle, keeping low feet, finding purchase on the wet ties through memory and instinct. Mercer met him at the switch stand on the far side. They collided with brutal force, no technique, no grace, just desperate violence. Mercer was bigger, heavier, stronger. But Dakota was fighting for his daughter's future. Mercer drove a knee into Dakota's wounded side. Dakota headbutted him, feeling the man's nose crunch. They grappled along the platform edge, trading vicious blows, fists to faces, elbows to ribs, knees to guts. Mercer slipped on the wet wood and fell, catching the edge of a tie. He dangled over the churning water 60 feet below legs, kicking in open air. Dakota could let him fall. No witnesses, natural justice. But Alice was watching from across the trestle, her small face pale in the lightning. He grabbed Mercer's wrist and hauled him up with a roar of effort, and then slammed him face down on the wet ties. He found the iron shackles on the fallen foreman's belt and cuffed Mercer's hands behind him. "You're going to trial," Dakota said through gritted teeth. "And you're going to confess, every detail. Because if you don't, I promise you'll wish I'd let you fall." The river flowed freely for the first time in months. At dawn, when word spread that the gate was destroyed, people rushed to the bank settlers and Lakota together, carrying every container they owned. Children splashed in the shallows, laughing. Women wept with relief. Cattle were led down to drink, bellowing as they plunged their muzzles into clean water. Dr. Barnaby, pale from blood loss, but functioning, stitched Genevieve's shoulder wound properly now that he had clean water for boiling instruments and washing. The wound would heal cleanly. Andrew's arm was bandaged and splinted. He'd have a wicked scar, but full use of the limb. The schoolhouse was a blackened ruin, but Genevieve stood in the ashes with the 3 orphans already planning where to rebuild. They'd salvaged the telegraph receiver from the basement, intact and functional. Jack tapped out a message to Judge Rutledge in Blue Mountain. Mercer arrested by citizens. Gate destroyed. Request immediate territorial marshal and circuit court session. A reply came within the hour. Marshal departing at dawn. Court to convene upon evidence review. The federal marshal arrived 2 days later, a hard-eyed man named Coleman, who'd spent 15 years keeping order in territories where law was more suggestion than rule. He arrested Mercer, officially read the charges, and began interviewing witnesses. When he searched Mercer's saddlebag, he found a second ledger, the man's personal accounts documenting every bribe, every fraudulent sale, every illegal payment. Mercer had kept records of his own crimes, either from paranoia or habit. It was enough. Crooked Teeth, Tom, wounded and facing accessory charges, agreed to testify in exchange for reduced sentencing. He provided detailed information about Mercer's orders, the Watergate operation, and the schoolhouse burning. Coyote Kid's body was found 3 miles downstream, wedged against a snag. Nobody claimed it. The twisted remains of the iron gate lay submerged in the current, bent and broken by the flood's force, a monument to greed rendered useless. The hearing convened in the livery stable, the only building in Widow's Well large enough to hold everyone who wanted to attend. Judge Rutledge presided, a stern man in his 60s with a reputation for fairness and a complete intolerance for frontier corruption. Mercer sat chained to a post, his expensive suit stained and torn face bruised from the fight on the trestle. Dr. Barnaby testified, first reconstructing his medical findings from memory with impressive detail. He recited names, dates, symptoms, progression timelines, all the data lost when his ledger washed away. Genevieve presented the telegraph intercepts, explaining how the orphans had built the tap and monitored communications. Jack, Samuel, and Peter demonstrated the device for the judge, showing exactly how it worked. Andrew spoke about the water rations, the dying cattle, the impossible debt structure designed to keep farmers trapped. Miriam testified about the night attack on the schoolhouse, identifying men she'd recognized among the attackers. Crooked teeth. Tom confirmed Mercer's direct orders to burn the schoolhouse and eliminate witnesses, providing dates, locations, and specific instructions he'd received. Through it all, Mercer sat silent, his face a stone mask. Then Alice stepped forward. She held a folded paper, water-stained and wrinkled. "I found this yesterday," she said clearly, her voice carrying in the packed stable. "Caught in the reeds upstream from the ford." She handed it to Judge Rutledge. He unfolded it carefully. His expression shifted from curiosity to surprise to grim satisfaction. It was the oilcloth-wrapped map that had enclosed Barnaby's ledger, the one that had fallen into the river. But the map itself, drawn in Barnaby's meticulous hand, had survived. It showed the precise engineering of Mercer's illegal intake structure, the sluice from Sola's stamp mill, the documented flow rates, and the dumping points for mercury tailings, all annotated with dates and measurements. Technical evidence preserved by chance and recovered by a child. "This," Rutledge said quietly, "combined with the testimony and the documented telegraph messages, constitutes sufficient evidence for prosecution." He looked at Mercer. "Valentine Mercer, you are hereby remanded to the territorial capital to stand trial for conspiracy fraud, sabotage, water rights violations, and accessory to attempted murder. Do you have anything to say?" Mercer's silence stretched. Finally, he said, "I was building something. Order, civilization. That costs money and requires control. None of you understand what it takes to make the frontier safe." "You poisoned children," Rutledge said flatly. "You extorted desperate farmers. You tried to murder witnesses. I understand perfectly what you were building, Mr. Mercer. The court does not find it impressive." The crowd erupted in shouts and applause. Outside, the livery dawn light spilled across the prairie, turning wet grass to gold. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and cool. Dakota leaned against the corral fence, his ribs tightly bound, but healing, watching the horizon, where the Badlands met the sky. Rose approached slowly, Alice walking between them. "What happens now?" Rose asked. Dakota looked at the land around them, the town rebuilding, the river flowing free, the people drawing water without fear or cost. "I'm going to build a shelter, near Andrew's boundary, where the land rises toward the buttes. Somewhere we can both live." "That won't be easy. People will talk." "Let them talk. I'm not the same girl you knew in 1870. I'm not the same either." He paused. "But we're here. That has to count for something." Alice took both their hands. "It counts for everything." Dakota knelt carefully, mindful of his ribs, and untied the beaded thong from his own wrist, the one Rose had given him 8 years ago. He fastened it around Alice's neck, the simple pattern of white and blue beads catching the morning light. Then he took Rose's hand and placed it over the necklace, covering it with his own. "This is us," he said quietly. "Past, present, future. all of it. Rose's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. Then we start now. Right now. No more waiting. They stood together in the rising light, the prairie wind carrying scents of sage and rain-washed earth. 6 weeks later, the territorial court in Blue Mountain returned its verdict. Valentin Mercer, guilty on all counts. His assets were liquidated to compensate victims. His water rights were revoked and returned to territorial control. Widows Well convened a town meeting to elect a new water council. Andrew Pike was appointed steward tasked with ensuring fair distribution to all residents and honoring treaty rights guaranteeing Lakota access to streams and rivers. The schoolhouse was rebuilt larger than before, with donated lumber from 3 neighboring towns. Genevieve resumed teaching with the 3 orphans as her assistants. The building included a small basement room where Samuel maintained the telegraph receiver now connected directly to the territorial marshal's office in Blue Mountain, as a safeguard against future corruption. Dr. Barnaby took on an apprentice, a young German immigrant named Gabriel Richter, who'd quit Mercer's freight crew after witnessing the schoolhouse attack. Gabriel proved skilled with medicines, fluent in 3 languages, and unafraid of the hard work frontier medicine required. Ricardo Sola's stamp mill was shut down by territorial order pending environmental remediation. Sola himself fled west, but federal marshals caught him in Wyoming territory. He was awaiting trial on charges of illegal dumping and public endangerment. The river ran clean again. Fish returned to the pools. The mercury sores and tremors gradually diminished among those who'd been poisoned, though some damage was permanent. Dakota built a solid sod shelter on a gentle rise near the boundary of Andrew's farm. It wasn't large, 2 rooms, a cooking hearth, a small stable, but it had a strong roof and windows facing both east toward the open prairie and west toward the Badlands. A place balanced between worlds. Rose taught school 3 mornings a week and sewed 4 evenings, contributing income toward supplies and necessities. Alice learned to read in 2 languages, to track game by observing disturbed grass and broken twigs, to identify edible plants and medicinal herbs, and to gauge river depth by watching the current's surface patterns. On an afternoon in late September, when the cottonwoods burned gold and the air carried the first edge of autumn chill, the 3 of them rode together along the wagon road where a girl had once saved a dying man. Dakota reined his pony to a halt at the exact spot. Nothing marked it, just another stretch of packed earth and prairie grass. But he remembered. He touched his healed ribs, feeling the puckered scar tissue beneath his shirt. Then he placed his hand gently on Alice's head, his fingers brushing the beaded necklace she wore. "What are you thinking?" Alice asked. "That some things are worth fighting for, and worth surviving for." A hawk circled overhead, wings dark against the endless blue. The prairie wind rose, carrying the mingled scents of sage-grass and the distant river. They rode on together, not into myth or legend, but into the hard, real-earned life they'd built. The kind of life that required daily work and constant vigilance. The kind that broke some people and forged others stronger. The kind worth every moment. Behind them, widows' wells spread across the basin, smoke rising from cook fires, children's voices carrying on the wind, the railroad whistle announcing the evening train. Life continuing, scarred, but healing. Ahead, the land stretched endlessly dangerous, beautiful, unforgiving, and full of terrible promise. They rode into it together,